Welcome back, Highlanders. If you are watching this video, congratulations, you've made it through the halfway point of the class and up another base camp in our climb up the macroeconomic mountain. So we just finished chapter 7 and 8 on macroeconomic accounting. The next chapter, chapter 9, is a big one. It's an introduction to basic macroeconomic markets. Of all the chapters, this is definitely the most graphically intense. We will go through these graphs slowly so that hopefully you can understand them as we're moving through them. But as always, just let me know if you have any questions about them, either through email or those Zoom office hours. But without further ado, let's get into Chapter 9, our hardcore macroeconomic chapter on, again, an introduction to basic macroeconomic markets. So moving into this chapter, right, the main things that we are going to be covering, or the overview for this chapter, is we're going to start off with the resource or labor market. If you had Econ 3 with me, then you've probably learned a little bit about that market, as we did talk about it briefly. If you hadn't, though, if you haven't had Econ 3 yet, don't worry about it. We're going to go through it as if you're hearing it for the first time. Then after that, it's all brand new for everybody, whether you've had Econ 3 or not. We're going to go into the loanable funds market and talk about the nominal and real interest rates. And then we're going to get into the foreign exchange market, and we're going to talk about appreciation and depreciation of currency. I'd say of all of them, the foreign exchange market might confuse students the most, so we'll definitely spend a lot of time in detail on that one. And then we're going to get into what I like to call the granddaddy of them all, the aggregate goods and services market, where there's not two curves but three, and there's not one equilibrium but two potential equilibriums there. So a short-run equilibrium and a long-run equilibrium. So we'll talk about how that works. And then finally, we'll talk about how this goods and services market relates to our business cycles. In other words, what does that look like when we're in a contraction or recession? And then what does it look like if we're in an expansion or economic boom? And then that'll be it for this chapter. Again, overall, a pretty graphically intense one. So let's get it going. The labor market is the very first of these macroeconomic markets that we're going to talk about. Now, the price for labor in the labor market is called the wage, right? Because that's just the price of labor. So abbreviate that with W. The quantity of labor is called employment, right? That's just the quantity of people who are employed, and so we abbreviate that with E. Other than that, though, it works just like the market for goods and services that we've been studying all along in Chapter 3, only with a different name for price and a different name for quantity. Again, we call price wage, we call quantity employment, but other than that, it works in the exact same way. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and graph out our labor market. So again, I'm going to exit the full screen mode so that we can use some different colors here. Right, so we're going to start off with just our normal vertical axis and our normal horizontal axis. Now remember, in Chapter 3, we had price and we had quantity here. We had an upward sloping supply curve that represented the fact that at higher prices, people like to produce and sell more. We had a downward sloping demand curve that represents at higher prices, people like to buy less, and at lower prices, people like to buy more. And when those two intersect, you have an equilibrium quantity, which we're going to call Q star, and an equilibrium price that we call P star. And that's what our goods and services market look like. So we're talking about the market for goods and services that we learned back in Chapter 3. That's what you're looking at. Now, in order to change that to the labor market, watch very carefully. We don't have to do that much, right? This P is no longer called the P. It's still a price. It's just now the price of labor, which we're going to call W for the wage rate. This Q, this is still quantity, but it's the quantity of labor, which we're going to change to E for employment level, right? So it's no longer P star, but it is now W star. And this is no longer Q star, but this is now E star. This is now called the supply of labor, and this is now called the demand for labor. And then once you do all that, this is no longer a goods and services market. It has now become a labor market, right? So again, we just call price something different. We call it wage. We just call quantity something different. We call it employment. But other than that, it works pretty much the same way. You have an upward sloping supply curve, and we have a downward sloping demand curve. And where those two curves intersect, you're going to have an equilibrium. We just have an equilibrium wage and employment level rather than what we call an equilibrium price or quantity when we were talking about this market in Chapter 3. So again, supply curves are still upward sloping. Demand curves are still downward sloping. Increase in supply is still shift to the right. Decrease in supply is still shift to the left. Increase in demand is still shift to the right. decrease in demand is still a shift to the left. Again, it works the exact same way, right? So William Shakespeare had a quote. He says, "A rose by any other name smells just as sweet," right? Well, market by any other name works pretty much the same way, right? Same idea here. It doesn't really matter the name, right? The mechanics of this market is going to be the same. Now we call this the resource market in the overview. So this works for any ingredient used to produce a good or service. Only the reason why we're calling it the labor market here is because the most common resource that we use to produce goods and services is, of course, people's labor. Right. So with that in mind, that's kind of what our labor market looks like. Let's go ahead and talk about where these curves come from. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about labor demand. So the only other difference between this market and the goods and services market that you learned back in Chapter 3 is how you think about how these curves are formed. So back in our Chapter 3 market, when we're talking about the supply and demand of goods and services like, say, pizza, for example, right? We think of individuals as demanding these pizza and businesses or the people who work at businesses as supplying that pizza, right? Well, it's opposite when it comes to this labor market, right? You want to think of individuals as the ones who are supplying their labor to businesses, and these businesses are firms. They're the ones who are demanding the labor, right? So firms are the ones who are doing the demanding here, right? It's not the individuals at households, but rather the people who are working at businesses who are demanding your time or your labor when you go to work for them, right? So firms are demanding labor. And because firms are demanding labor, it makes sense that this labor demand curve is downward sloping, or again, inversely related, an inverse relationship between wage and employment, because as wages go down, firms tend to want to hire more people. And as wages go up, firms tend to want to hire fewer people. And that should make sense, right? If you're running a business and you can hire somebody for less money, you're going to be more eager to hire them if you can pay them a lower wage than you would be to hire them if you have to pay them a higher wage. Right, so again, we have this downward sloping labor demand curve. Let's go ahead and graph that out. So again, we're looking at, let's start off in our labor market this time, now that you know how the conversion works, where we're going to have wage, and again, the employment level, and you're going to have a downward sloping demand for labor. So again, this will be D subscript L, that represents our demand for labor. Now imagine that you had to pay a worker, say, $20 an hour. Well, again, if you're out there making the call when it comes to hiring somebody, and you know that you got to pay them $20 an hour, you might only be willing to hire, say, 5 people at that wage. Or if you want to think of it, you might only be willing to hire somebody for, say, 5 hours at that wage, right? Whereas if the wage was lower, say $10 an hour, you might be more inclined to hire more people or hire somebody for a longer period of time. So at a wage of $10 an hour, you might be willing to hire somebody for, say, 10 hours, or again, maybe if you want to think of it this way, as hiring 10 people for that wage, right? So again, the idea here is that the lower the wage, well, the more eager you are to hire somebody. The higher the wage, the less eager you're going to be to hire somebody, right? So again, you're going to have a lower employment level when the wages are higher, and then you're going to have a higher employment level when the wages are lower as far as the labor demand curve is concerned, right? So again, the quantity of labor being demanded when the wage is $20 an hour might be 5 individuals. The quantity of labor being demanded when the wage is $10 an hour would be 10 individuals. Right? Now, you're also going to have in the same graph an upward sloping supply curve. We'll talk about how to derive that supply curve here in a second. But again, when you have a supply of labor, you're going to have an equilibrium quantity and wage rate. Right, so again, maybe we have an equilibrium or E star here at 7 people and an equilibrium wage rate here, or W star, at $15 an hour. Right, so if that is the case, right, what happens if there's an increase in the demand for labor? Right, what happens if the demand for labor goes up? Well, again, this market works just like all your other markets in the same kind of way. If you have an increase in the demand for labor, that is a shift to the right of that labor demand curve. So it's going to look something like this. And when that happens, that's going to give us a new equilibrium. right, where you might be willing to hire, say, 10 people at $20 an hour. So when does this increase in labor demand happen? Well, usually during times of like expansion, right? So as you can see, when demand for labor goes up, like that happens during our economic booms or expansions, when the economy is really doing well, we tend to want to hire more people and we're willing to pay them more because we need to produce more products, right? So again, this is going to cause our employment level to go up, as we can see here, and it's going to want to cause our wage level to go up, as we can see here. Once again, both quantity and price move in the same direction as demand. We just have a different name for quantity and price. We call it employment and wage, right? So again, the rules are the same. They both move in the same direction as demand, and that should make sense, right? If we're more eager to hire people, then you got more people employed, and we're going to be willing to pay them higher wages, right? Again, we just have a different name for our quantity and price now. We call it employment and wage, but they both still move in the same direction as demand. When demand goes up, they both go up. Now, what happens during some bad economic times like a contraction or a recession, right? So let's say that this COVID-19 outbreak has thrown our economy into a recession. If that's the case, then we might not be producing as much stuff now, so you're going to have a decrease in labor demand, right? Not as eager to hire people during this recession as we were during other better times. So we'll call this DL3. And again, that means that you're going to be willing to hire fewer people and pay them lower wages, right? And that should make sense intuitively speaking. If the labor demand has gone down because you don't need to produce nearly as many products because people just aren't out there buying products anymore, then you don't need as many workers, right? So you're not going to hire as many, and because you don't need them as bad, you're going to pay them lower wages, which tends to be what happens during these recessions, right? You tend to have lower levels of employment or higher unemployment, and again, people tend to get paid less than in those more economically beneficial times. So when the demand for labor goes down, again, it makes sense intuitively that your employment level will go down and your wage level will go down. Again, you can just memorize that they both move in the same direction as demand, or when in doubt, you can always graph it out. Remember, the graph will always tell you the answer. Just like your other graph that you learned in Chapter 3, increases or shifts to the right, decreases or shifts to the left. Remember that, graph it out, and you can see what happens to wages and employment when labor demand changes. All right, so that's how the labor demand curve works, and that's what happens when we see these changes in labor demand. Moving forward, as you might expect, we're going to talk about labor supply next. Right, again, I want you to think of workers or people who are working for other individuals as those who are supplying their labor. Right, so again, it's these individuals or households that are supplying their labor to the businesses. And as you can imagine, people like working when they get paid more. So labor supply curve is upward sloping because there's that direct relationship between wages and the quantity of labor that people want to supply. So as wage increases, people will want to work more. And as wages decrease, people will want to work less. So people always ask me, Joel, do you think it's unfair that we have this downward sloping labor demand curve, or that businesses like to pay people lower wages? And I don't think that's any less fair than the idea that people only like to work for higher wages, right? Again, people are just responding to the incentives that are shown to them, right? So again, in the same way that businesses like to pay people lower wages, or that in the same way that people like to buy things for lower prices, right? Sellers like to sell things for higher prices, and people like to work more when they get paid more, right? So again, all these curves follow that same kind of intuition where people are just responding to incentives. So let's go ahead and graph out that labor supply curve. All right, so once again, we're gonna be in the labor market here. So you have a vertical axis where we measure wage, and a horizontal axis where we measure employment. So again, why do we have an upward sloping labor supply curve? Again, the way to think of it is at a wage of, say, $10 an hour, you might only have 5 people who want to work out there, or somebody might only be willing to work for, say, 5 hours, if you want to think of it that way. If you want to think kind of how you would make this personal decision. Whereas if the wage was $20 an hour, you as a worker, you might be willing to stay out there and work for, say, 10 hours. Or you might have, say, 10 people who want to work at that particular wage. Right? So again, the higher the wage, the more people want to work. The lower the wage, the less people want to work. That's the way it traditionally works. Again, there are a few exceptions to this rule that you might learn if you take a behavioral economics class, But here in these intro classes, right, we just kind of follow those rules and don't worry about the exceptions. So with that in mind, you probably figured that we're going to draw a downward sloping labor demand curve in this graph. So it's going to look something like this. That's our downward sloping demand for labor, right? And again, where the two intersect, you're going to have a market equilibrium, right? This is going to be your equilibrium employment level. E star, again, we'll say that's 7 employees or people employed. And then we're going to have an equilibrium wage rate, W star, which again, we're going to say is $15 an hour. So with that in mind, what happens if our supply of labor changes, right? What happens if people are out there more willing to work? Well, again, you're going to have an increase in the supply of labor, and that's going to be a shift to the right of that labor supply curve. So it's going to look something like this. So the more that people are out there wanting to work, then the more that supply curve is going to shift to the right. And when labor supply shifts to the right, because there are more people out there looking for work, as you might expect, that increase is going to cause the number of people employed to increase. And you can see that from this graph here, right? Well, because you do have so many more people out there willing to work, you don't need to pay them nearly as much to get them to work. In other words, you have a lot more workers to choose from, so you can start to offer lower wages, and that's what might cause that wage rate to go down. So just like in the case in Chapter 3, when supply goes up or shifts to the right, you're going to see quantity increase, but you're going to see price move in the opposite direction and decrease. Again, we just have a different name for quantity and price. We call quantity employment, and we call price the wage. Now, if you were to have a decrease in the supply of labor, maybe because everybody got sick with that COVID-19 virus, right? That could be a reason why you have so few people out there trying to work, right? Then you're going to see a decrease or shift to the left here of that labor supply curve. So we call that SL3, right? Whereas, we call that 2. Right, now when you have the supply of labor decrease, right, as you can imagine, you're going to have fewer people employed when you have less people out there trying to find jobs. And at the same time, because you have fewer workers to choose from, there's more competition over the few workers that are available, and that's going to cause employers to pay them higher wages. Right, so as you can imagine, when the supply of labor goes down, you're going to see a decrease in the number of people employed. You're going to see employment go down, but you'll see an increase and the wage rate. Once again, quantity is going to move in the same direction as supply, but price or wage is going to move in the opposite direction. Right. So again, this labor market works just like the market for goods and services that we talked about in Chapter 3. Not really a whole lot of difference between them. So that is the labor market. So you now know what happens when the demand for labor changes as well as when the supply of labor changes. So that is the first of these macroeconomic markets that we're going to talk about. Let's go ahead and move on and talk about the loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market is the market that coordinates the borrowing and lending decisions of business firms and households. Right? So whenever you take your money and you deposit it into, say, BB&T or Bank of America or Wells Fargo, then you are part of this loanable funds market. If you ever borrowed money, whether it's to buy a car or to buy a house or maybe to go to school, then you're also part of this loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market, again, works in a similar way to the goods and services market from Chapter 3. We just call the price of loanable funds the real interest rate, which we're going to abbreviate with a lowercase r. And then we call the quantity of loanable funds the amount saved or invested. So as you're putting money in the bank or saving it, right, that's the quantity of loanable funds being saved. And then when you borrow money for the purposes of, say, buying a house or getting your education, then that's the quantity of money being invested. But either way, the price is the real interest rate. That is the amount of money that you get in, when you put money in a bank, right? You're going to get paid some interest rate on that money, right? And that is essentially the benefit you get from putting that money in the bank versus spending it or holding on to it. But that real interest rate is also what you're going to pay when you borrow money from the bank, right? So with that in mind, you can think of the real interest rate as, again, just the price of those loanable funds, right? Otherwise, again, similar to the goods and services market that we have already talked about. So for those of you who maybe haven't had bank accounts or don't know how interest works, Right, just real briefly, when you put, say, a $100 deposit into a bank, and let's say that bank pays you 1% interest, then not only are they going to hold on to your $100 and you're able to pull that $100 out whenever you like, but you're also going to get that 1% interest, which means at the end of the term in which that interest is paid, they're going to give you $1, so you have 101 in the bank and not just 100. Right, so again, that interest is kind of the price that the bank is giving you for letting them use your money while you're not using it. Now, when you say borrow money from the bank, let's say you borrow $100 and they say you got to pay back 1% interest, then when you pay back that $100 loan, you also have to pay back that interest of $1 or $101 to pay off that $100 loan. Again, that is the price you pay for using that money that the bank was holding on to, right, because you needed it sooner than before you could get it on your own. So with that in mind, that's kind of how that interest rate works. And real interest rate just means it's been adjusted for inflation. So let's go ahead and graph ourselves out a loanable funds market, focusing on, again, on how it's pretty similar to the goods and services market. So once again, we're going to use some different colors here. So we're going to have a regular loanable funds market here where we're going to have R on the vertical axis. That is going to represent the real interest rate. And then you're going to have the quantity of money being saved and invested here on the horizontal axis, right? So the quantity of savings and the quantity of money being invested. And when you hear investment in economics, I want you to think of you borrowing money. So we're assuming that you're borrowing money to invest in, say, a house or an education or a new business idea or something like that. So again, when you think of investment, I want you to think of borrowing money for those purposes. Right, so with that in mind, again, you're going to have an upward sloping supply curve. This is the supply of savings. And then you're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. And this is going to be the demand to borrow money or the demand for investment funds. So you know, a lot of times when people hear that word investing, they're thinking of like Wall Street, like putting money in a stock market or something like that. And here in economics, again, we're just thinking of investing as borrowing money to maybe start a business or go to school. Right. So again, think of investment as borrowing from here on out. And then we've got, again, the equilibrium quantity of money being saved and invested. So this is the quantity of money saved is going to be equal to the quantity of money being borrowed or invested. And that's all going to happen at an equilibrium interest rate. Here we're going to call that R star, right? So this QSI star is, again, where the quantity of savings is equal to the quantity of investment. And that's what your loanable funds market is going to look like. So let's talk about where these curves come from, or again, why this demand curve is downward sloping, and why the supply curve is upward sloping. So again, think of businesses as the ones who are doing the demanding here. They're demanding loanable funds, mostly so they can invest in more business ideas. So open up a new factory, or maybe get some more equipment for their firm or their business. So again, the firms or businesses are the ones who are demanding loanable funds. And then it's downward sloping because we tend to like to borrow money at a lower interest rate. Right? If you're out there trying to, say, get a mortgage for a house, you want the lowest interest rate possible. Ways to do that is make sure you have 20% down payment, make sure you have a good credit score and a good credit history. Right? Those are things that are going to help keep your interest rates low. Right? So again, the lower the interest rate, the better. So you're going to want to borrow more money when the interest rate is lower. You're not going to want to borrow money when you got to pay back that really high interest rate. Right, so again, because you have this inverse relationship between the quantity of loanable funds that are being demanded and that interest rate, you're going to have a downward sloping demand curve for those loanable funds, right? And as per usual, an increase in the desire to invest is going to shift that demand curve to the right, and a decrease in the desire to invest is going to shift that demand curve to the left, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at what that's going to look like on the graph. So again, we're going to have a vertical axis and a horizontal axis here. Right, again, you have the real interest rate, and you're going to have the quantity of money being saved and invested. And you're going to have a downward sloping demand curve. This is again going to represent the demand for those investment funds or those loanable funds there, right? So again, at a 10% interest rate, your quantity of investment that you're trying to borrow is probably going to be somewhat lower, maybe $10,000, than it would be if the interest rate was, say, like 5%. So at a 5% interest rate, the quantity of money that you're willing to borrow, call that QI2 versus QI1 here, right? We'll call that, say, $20,000. Again, you're going to be willing to borrow more money at a lower interest rate because that's less money that you're going to have to pay back when you go to pay back that loan, right? So with that in mind, right, of course, you're going to have an upward sloping supply curve for loanable funds, looking something like this. And this is the supply, again, of savings. And where those two intersect, the amount of money being saved is exactly equal to the amount of money being borrowed. So this is both quantity of savings and investment. And we say that maybe that's going to be 15,000. And then again, there's a real interest rate that kind of brings the supply and demand curve into harmony. Our R star, we'll say that is 7%. Okay. Now, what happens if we are in a time period in which people are more eager to borrow money? Right, maybe because, again, the economy is booming and therefore businesses are going to want to borrow more money to expand their production process, get some new machines or some new factories or things like that going. Well, as per usual, an increase in demand is going to shift that curve to the right. So let's go ahead and draw in that new demand curve, looking something like that. So the higher this demand for loanable funds, as you might expect, the more money people are willing to borrow, and the higher the interest rate that people are willing to pay. Right. So with that in mind, when the demand for loanable funds goes up, right, you are going to see an increase both in the quantity of loanable funds as well as the real interest rate. They both move in the same direction as demand. Again, that is a rule that never changes, right? Now, with that in mind, if you were to have a decrease in loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds, right, maybe again because the economy is not doing so well, it's in a recession, businesses do not need to borrow as much money to expand their factory sizes or get new machines because they're just not producing as much, right? Again, any decrease in demand is going to be a shift to the left of that demand curve. So we'll call this D, or demand for investment 3. And of course, where that intersects the supply curve, that gives us our new equilibrium, where you're going to see less money being saved and invested, and you're going to see interest rates go down. Right? So if you ever wonder why interest rates tend to go down during recessions, this is one of the reasons. So you're going to see the demand for investment decrease. Again, you're going to see the quantity of savings and investment decrease, and the interest rates decrease. They both move in the same direction as demand. Again, a rule that never changes, right? So again, if you haven't memorized it already, just remember that whenever demand changes, both quantity and price move in the same direction, whether we're talking about the quantity and price of goods and services, whether we're talking about the quantity and price of labor, which we call the employment and wage rate, or the quantity and price of loanable funds, which again is just the quantity of money saved and invested and the real interest rate. Right. So again, it works the same in all those cases. So that's what happens when the demand for loanable funds changes, right? And again, know where the demand for loanable funds comes from. It's the fact that people want to borrow money and they prefer to borrow money at a lower interest rate. So again, there's that inverse relationship between the amount they want to borrow and that interest rate. So now we're going to move on to the supply of loanable funds. Right, so individuals, whether they be people who work for other people or people who run their own businesses or whatever, right, any money that you are not spending then or not paying your taxes with, then you're going to be saving. So it's individuals who supply loanable funds through their savings. So whenever you're putting your money in, say, Bank of America is not sitting on that money, right? That's the money they use to loan out to other banks or other businesses or other people, right? So your student loans that you might have gotten from a bank may have come in the form of, again, somebody else's savings. Right, so banks don't hold on to the money; they go ahead and lend it out. We'll talk about more about how they do that in Chapter 13. But for now, know that whenever you're putting money in the bank, you are supplying those loanable funds. Now, savings is any after-tax income not spent on consumption. Right, so in economics, after you make some money, you got to pay your taxes. After you're done paying your taxes, whatever money you have left over, your net income, or what we call disposable income, because that's the money you actually get to choose what to do with it, you can either consume or you can save. Anything that you're not spending on consumption, we call savings. So savings is any, again, after-tax income that you are not spending. Right. Now, the reason why your supply of loanable funds is upward sloping is because you tend to want to save more when the interest rates are higher, because that means that the bank's going to pay you more money for having money in the bank, right? If the interest rates are really low, that means the bank's not giving you money for putting money, or not giving you as much money for putting money in the bank, so you might want to save less. So again, there's a direct relationship between the amount you want to save and the interest rates that you're going to get paid for saving. Right, now an increase in savings is of course a shift to the right, and a decrease in savings is a shift to the left. As always, all increases are shifts to the right, all decreases are shifts to the left. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that supply of loanable funds graph looks like. So again, if we're talking about the supply of loanable funds, you know we're going to be in that loanable funds market, where we're going to be measuring the real interest rate, and again the quantity of money being both saved and borrowed or invested. And again, when we're talking about the supply of loanable funds, then it's going to be an upward sloping curve that represents people's desire to save. So at an interest rate of, say, again, 5%, you might not be as eager to save as if the interest rates were higher. Again, the quantity of savings that you might want to put in the bank would be like $10,000. But if somebody told you that you would get 10% rate of return or interest from that same bank, then you might be less eager to spend money and more eager to put money in that bank. So with an interest rate that high, then you might put, say, $20,000 into that bank account. Right, so again, the higher the interest rate, the more eager you are to put money in the bank. The lower the interest rate, the less eager you are to put money in the bank. And once again, on the same graph, we could have a downward sloping demand curve here. Looking something like that. So this is our demand for those investment funds, and where the two intersect, you're going to have an equilibrium quantity of savings and investment. That's where the amount being borrowed is equal to the amount being put in the bank. Again, we'll say that that is right in between at 15,000, and there's an interest rate that makes that happen. So we'll call that R star, and again, for the sake of argument, we'll say that is 7%, somewhere between 5 and 10 here. All right. So again, what happens if we were to have an increase in the supply of savings? Like what would happen if people are just more eager to put money in the bank? Maybe again, they're anticipating a recession or some bad times, and they know they need to store up some money right, in case those bad times hit. Right? What happens when the supply of savings goes up? Well, again, that's just going to be a shift to the right of that supply curve. Something like that. We'll call this supply of savings 2. And where that hits that original demand curve, that's going to give us this new equilibrium, which you notice is going to have a higher amount of money being saved and borrowed, but again, lower interest rates, right? So once again, the quantity increases with supply. That hasn't changed. And the price, again, moves in the opposite direction, something that we know is always true from the past. So again, that real interest rate is going to go down. Now, what happens if the supply of savings were to decrease for whatever reason? Right? Imagine again that people are less eager to save money, maybe more eager to spend it. Like we're in a consumer-driven culture. Right, you can see that supply curve for savings shift to the left, and where that happens, you're going to see the interest rates go up and the amount of money being saved and borrowed go down. So when the supply of savings goes down, once again, quantity is going to go down with it. That's nothing new. And the interest rates are going to go up, as you might expect. Again, quantity moves in the same direction as supply, right? Interest rates or price moves in the opposite direction of supply. So if you understood that graph from Chapter 3, then you should have understood these last two graphs. They're really not all that different. Again, mechanically, they work the same way. You just have to know what we're measuring. In the loanable funds market, we're measuring interest rates versus the quantity of money saved and invested. In the labor market, we're measuring wages versus the employment level. Right. So again, make sure you know why all these curves are sloped the way that they are, right? In other words, know the incentives behind why each curve looks the way that it does. And again, what happens to quantity and price, no matter what we call quantity and price in each of these markets when supply or demand shifts. Okay. So before we move on to the next market, we do need to point out the difference between what we call the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. So the nominal interest rate is the percentage of the amount borrowed that must be paid to the lender in addition to the repayment of the principal. So again, if you borrow $100 at, say, 5% interest, then you have to pay back that $100 plus an additional $5 in interest. That 5% interest is the nominal interest rate. The real interest rate is that nominal interest rate that's been adjusted for inflation, or it's the real cost of borrowing and lending money once you've taken prices into account. Right? So again, it's the real cost of that borrowing and lending money once you take into account this idea of prices, or changes in prices, which we call inflation. So the real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate, right? So again, that R is our real interest rate. That I, or lowercase I, is our abbreviation for our nominal interest rate. And that symbol pi there, that doesn't mean 3.14 like it means in most math classes, right? What it means in economics is inflation, simply because we already using I for nominal interest rate. So what do we call inflation? Or we got to start dipping into Greek symbols, right? And so we call that the symbol for pi, right? So again, real interest rate is nominal interest rate minus inflation. Right. So what we mean by that is if the real interest rate, or sorry, if the nominal interest rate is 6% and the inflation rate is 2%, that means the real interest rate is 4%. Right. So basically, what we're saying here is that let's say the bank says, hey, if you borrow $100, you got to pay back the $100 at a 6% interest rate. So a year from now, when you pay back the $100, you might pay back $106. The $100 that you borrowed plus the 6% or $6 in interest. But if you had a 2% inflation rate during that time period, then that means that even though you're handing them $106, that $106 could only buy what $104 could have bought a year ago. So you're paying back $106 in money, but you're really only paying back $104 worth of value, right? So again, the higher the interest rate is, or I'm sorry, the higher the inflation rate is, right, then the lower that real interest rate is going to be because you're going to be paying back with dollars that are worth less than the dollars that you borrowed, right? So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about how this interest rate and inflation are related. When the actual rate of inflation is greater than anticipated or greater than we thought it was going to be, then it's the borrowers who gain and the lenders who lose. So the banks often try to incorporate what they think the inflation rate is going to be when they're charging you the interest rate that they expect you to pay back. But they could always get it wrong, just the way that economists tend to get a lot of things wrong. So when the actual rate of inflation turns out to be greater than we thought it was, again, it is the borrowers who gain and the lenders who lose, right? Again, the borrowers are paying back dollars that are worth less than what the bank thought that they would be, right? So the borrowers win at the expense of lenders. When the actual rate of inflation is less than what banks think they thought it would be, then it's the lenders who gain and the borrowers who lose, right? So again, the lenders win and the borrowers lose when the actual rate of inflation is less than we thought it was going to be. And then finally, when it's important to know that inflation doesn't usually help borrowers and lenders in any systematic manner. And what I mean by that is that sometimes it's the borrowers who win because inflation is higher than we thought. Sometimes it's the lenders who win because inflation turns out to be lower than we thought. No one group usually wins more than the other. All right, let's go through a quick example so that you understand kind of how this works, right? So again, make sure you know the formula that real interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. Right, now let's say that a bank is expecting a, say, 5% rate of return, right? That's what they want to earn. They want to earn 5%, and they think that the inflation rate is going to be 3%, so they're going to want to set the nominal interest rate at 8%. So if you borrow $100 from us, then you got to pay back $108. That'll give us $105 worth of value, which is what we hope to make on this loan. Now let's say that inflation is higher than anticipated. Let's say that again, once the bank makes the contract, they can't change that nominal interest rate, so that's got to stay at 8%. But what if inflation turns out to be, say, 6%? Well, that means that the real interest rate is 2%. You're still paying back the $108. That part hasn't changed, but the $108 that you're paying back isn't worth $105 worth of value anymore. It's only worth $102 worth of value once you take inflation into account. So again, you're paying back dollars that are worth less than you thought they'd be. The bank is accepting dollars that are worth less than they thought they'd be. You win as the borrower, the bank loses, right? But in this case, I want you to imagine that, again, the formula here hasn't changed. And again, banks are hoping to make a total of 5% in real interest when they expect inflation to be 3%. So they're going to make that nominal interest rate 8%. But now imagine a situation where inflation turns out to only be 1%. Once again, you got to pay the same 8% back no matter what inflation is. That's in the contract of the money you borrowed, right? But if inflation is only 1%, that means that the real interest rate is 7%. So once again, you're still paying back the same $108. That part hasn't changed. It's just instead of that $108 being worth $105 worth of real money or real value, it's worth $107 worth of real value. And so again, you're paying back with dollars that are worth more than you thought they'd be when you borrowed it. The bank is accepting dollars that are worth more than they thought they'd be when they lent it out. So it is the banks who win, and it is the borrower who loses, right? So again, the borrower wins when inflation is lower than borrowers win when inflation is higher than we thought. The lenders win when the inflation rate is lower than we thought. Now, it's important to note that when you are putting money in the bank in a savings account, right, then again, that is a situation where you're actually the lender. It's when you're borrowing money from the bank that you are the borrower. So if you have a really high savings rate, then you're going to be happy when inflation is lower than we think. However, if you're somebody who has a whole lot of money borrowed in terms of student loans, then you're going to be happy when inflation is higher than we think. Right? So again, some people are kind of both, right? They have money in the bank and they also have some loans that they need to pay back, in which case they're both borrowers and lenders, right? So again, this inflation doesn't really help anybody in any kind of systematic manner. All right, and then the last thing that we're going to talk about is the relationship between interest rates and bond prices, right? So interest rates and bond prices are inversely related. And what I mean by that is that when the interest rates go up, the price of previously issued bonds tends to go down. When the interest rates go down, the price of previously issued bonds tends to go up, right? So when the interest rate rises, the market value of those previously issued bonds fall. Or another way to read this sentence is when the interest rate falls, then the market value of previously issued bonds will rise. So again, rather than having to write the sentence twice, just read it with the word before the word in parentheses first, and then read it with the word in parentheses replacing the word before the word in parentheses second, and it says the same thing. There's an inverse relationship between interest rates and bond prices. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and explore how that relationship exists. So for those of you who don't know what a bond is, it's kind of like an IOU, right? So imagine that you get a $100 bond that pays 10% interest and matures in a year. So basically a business might say, hey, we need some money now. We're going to go ahead and sell you this piece of paper that says that we're going to owe you $100 plus 10% interest a year from now, and hopefully our business will have taken off by now and be able to pay back that bond, right? So you give them $100, you are now in possession of this piece of paper that says when that bond matures in a year, you can get your $100 back plus 10% interest, so the company should be able to hand you $110. Now, you have a couple choices. You can either wait a year and turn in that bond for the $110, which is the $100 in original value plus the $10 in interest, or before that year expires, you can sell that bond on the secondary market to someone else for whatever somebody's willing to pay for it. So again, maybe you decide that you do need that $100 sooner than a year from now, so you find somebody else and say, hey, if you turn in this piece of paper, you'll be able to get $110 when this piece of paper matures, but I need some money now, so I'll sell it to you for maybe $100 or $102 or $105, right? Probably any amount less than 110 is something that somebody might consider paying for it, right? So again, you can sell that bond on the secondary market to someone else if you decide you need that money sooner. After all, the business doesn't care who turns in that piece of paper, just whoever turns it in is going to get that $110. But what if during that time period that you are considering selling your bond on the secondary market, what if interest rates go up? So what happens to the price of your previously issued 10% bond on the secondary market when the interest rates on new bonds increases to 20%? Well, now anybody who is thinking about buying bonds, right, you can either buy your crappy 10% bond or they can buy this new bond coming out at 20% interest, which means if they got $100 to spend, if they buy the new bond, then a year from now they can get $120 versus $110. They're no longer going to want your crappy 10% bond. So the only way that you're going to be able to sell your bond on the secondary market is at a lower price, right? So if you decide you really need money badly now, then you might end up selling that bond for, say, $99 or $95 or something like that. Because again, anybody with $100 is going to want to buy the new bonds instead, unless, of course, right, they can get your bond for cheaper, right? So it's going to make the value of your previous issued bond go down. Now, what happens to the price of your previously issued 10% bond on the secondary market if the interest rates on the new bonds decrease to 5%? Right? Well, now your bond is incredibly valuable. So when the new bonds are coming out, people who have $100 to spend, they can either buy those new bonds at 5% interest, or they can buy your now awesome 10% bond that's going to pay them 10% interest. Well, again, they'd rather have your 10% bond than that 5% bond, so they're going to want to be able to buy your bond and be willing to pay more for it. So now you really might be able to sell your bond for, say, $102 or $104 or something like that, and people would still be able to make money off of it. So again, the value of your previous issued bond will increase when the interest rates on those new bonds will decrease, right? So again, there's people who try to predict what's going to happen to interest rates and therefore try to make money on the bond market. Like if they think that the interest rates are going to go down, then they know that the value of those bonds are going to go up. They might try to buy those bonds before those interest rates go down. If they think that the interest rates are going to go up, they know that the value of those previous issued bonds are going to go down. They might try to get rid of those bonds before those interest rates increase. So you can make some money doing that if you're good at predicting those things. On average, people usually aren't very good at predicting those things, even economists, so it can be hard to do. But if you can figure out a way to do it, there's a way to make money there. All right, so let's go ahead and round out this first lecture video here in Chapter 9 with a couple of practice questions. This one says, suppose the annual rate of inflation has been 3% during each of the last 3 years, and that borrowers and lenders have come to expect this rate of inflation. If the inflation rate unexpectedly rises, so again, inflation is higher than we think it's going to be, then which of the following is true? If you've been paying attention, you should know that when the interest rate is higher than we expect it to be, it's the borrowers who gain at the expense of the lenders, because the real money, the value of that money that they're paying back is going to be lower than they thought it was going to be. So borrowers win, again, the lenders lose. Right, so again, when the interest rate is unexpectedly higher than we thought it was going to be, it is the borrowers who end up paying back dollars that are worth less than we thought, and therefore borrowers gain at the expense of the lenders. Right? It's not the fact that lenders will gain at the expense of the borrowers. Again, that happens when the inflation rate is lower than we expect it to be. Right? The real interest rate will not necessarily exceed the nominal interest rate in this particular case. Right? Again, if the inflation is higher than we expect it to be, then the real interest rate will be lower than it otherwise would be, and certainly lower than that nominal interest rate. And again, the fact that there's no reason to expect that inflation will help borrowers relative to the lenders, right, isn't true in this case when we know inflation is higher than expected. And then one more practice question. It says, you just bought a $1,000 bond that's scheduled to mature in 10 years. If the interest rates rise during the next 6 months, then the market value or price of your bond will, and the answer here, hopefully if you've been paying attention, is B, decrease. Right? Remember when the interest rates go up, the price of your previously issued bonds will go down. If interest rates go down, then the value of your previously issued bonds will go up, right? So again, bond prices and interest rates are always inversely related. When the rates go up, bond prices go down. When rates go down, bond prices go up. All right, so that is the end of part 1 lecture video for chapter 9. When we come back for part 2, we're going to talk about the foreign exchange market, which again is I think the one that probably confuses students the most. So make sure you come back for part 2 of chapter 9 and pay close attention to that video. Until then, just let me know if you have any questions by shooting me an email or come visiting me during those office hours, and I'll be happy to help you with these graphs or any other questions that you might have regarding chapter 9 or the rest of the class. So again, come back for part 2, but until then, just let me know if you need anything. Take care.